Thanks everyone for being here at today's demo day. My name is Nifemi Bangwashe. I'm an AI project management intern on the industry innovation team here at Vector. And I'm going to be talking about one of the projects that I did over the past couple of months. So it's on generative AI, looking at it from a business strategy, technical execution, and control and governance perspective. So just an overview of what I'm going to be speaking about. I'll first give a brief overview of Vector's thought leadership projects, sort of my lens of the value that they bring to the industry, why generative AI was a good topic to discuss, especially given we understand the context of generative AI in today's world, but why especially it was important for enterprises, going over this specific project and what the goals were and the outcomes, giving a brief overview of sort of some insights. So these are essentially things that I observed through discussions over multiple days, not saying anything specific to a company, but sort of common patterns over those days. And then discussing sort of some insights that I gained from the entire project and sort of what I think a way forward with regards generative AI and innovation within the Canadian AI ecosystem can be. So I'll just be starting off with thought leadership projects, right? So I think most of us know our thought leadership projects here at Vector. I think they serve a unique opportunity of bringing competitors across different industries within the Canadian AI ecosystem into a place where they can openly share, so they can discuss, connect to build networks, as well as share best practices and observations from their own insights working in the industry. So, in AI, but in any industry in general, different organizations are at different states in development of any technology. And as Vector, with the goal of enabling AI adoption across Canada, these thought leadership projects serve a unique opportunity to bring the people who are at different stages in that development in the place where they can share and collaborate openly. So why generative AI, right? I'll start from, the general context that most of us already have. Like when most consumers or individuals think of Gen AI, right? So it's usually something like what you see on your screen. Yeah. So some form of, pair programming, like like GitHub Copilot, something that helps you write code, or something that makes it easier for you to write emails, or something that makes, it's easier for you to generate slides or edit pictures. But for an enterprise, something like, for instance, ChatGPT or any other generative technology looks a bit different, right? So we identified a couple sort of broad frames where an enterprise's views of generative AI could come from. So for instance, from a technical execution perspective, an organization, when they have a generative tool like ChatGPT or any other generative AI tool, right? They think first of technical execution, right? So do we have the capability to build this tool in-house? What does it mean for us to build this tool? How can we build it? How would building this tool interact with our existing software or technology infrastructure? And then from a control and governance perspective, what kind of regulations currently exist in this industry? How will having this tool or this product to our customers affect these regulations? What interactions do we have? And then from a business strategy perspective, if we do build this kind of tool, right, how do we take it to the market? How does this interact with the other services that we provide? And then there are a couple concerns that sort of that express across the board of these general windows, right? So like data risk, right? So you can look at data risk from a technical execution perspective, right? So if the developers within my organization are using user data to build a Gen AI tool, what kind of risks are associated with that from the perspective of, sensitive data being leaked, but also from the perspective of data regulations across countries and organizations. And then looking at accuracy from both a technical execution perspective and a control and governance perspective. So when we do develop a model, how sure are we that the outputs of this model are accurate? What can we do to make them more accurate? And what negative effects could a reduction in accuracy have on the public's perception of our enterprise? I'll be going over sort of what we intended to achieve through the thought leadership project. So building upon those sort of central themes we identified, we carried out a 4-day project across these individual business groups, So the first day was sort of an open plenary session where we introduced all of our participants across different industries and organizations to what we intended to achieve. And then we had a business strategy session where we focused on maximizing business potential through GenAI, and then looking at generative AI from a control and governance perspective, and then from a technical perspective specifically. On each of these days, we had speakers, we had keynote speakers and roundtables and workshops where we focused heavily on these specific influences on an enterprise. And then the goal is to have an outcome as a paper. So the final project deliverable is intended to be a paper. In terms of participants, we had over 32 companies participating, over 150 participants across the 4 days, including the top 5 banks in Canada, a lot of regulations, some of the largest telcos, and even some startups in this industry that have raised over $20 million in funding over the last year. Now I'll be providing some insights on each specific stream, my opinions on what sort of some salient issues were, and then going over what I believe that some salient issues are across the board and how we can move forward through these issues. So from a business strategy perspective, one of the most repeated themes is that it's very important to ensure that you're finding the right tool for the problem and not the other way around. So for instance, with the current, at risk of saying the wrong word, hype around Gen AI, a lot of organizations have been trying to say, okay, you know what, we have Gen AI as a thing. How can we use this? But then one of the common patterns that we're starting to see, that I'm starting to see build out as tools are approaching maturity, as these Gen AI tools are approaching maturity, is that it's more important to ensure precise problem tool fit for Gen AI. So instead of looking at it as something that you need to have, you should start from analyzing business use cases, see the problems within the organization, and then find the best tool for that. And that might or might not be Gen AI. So I have an image here on the right. This is from an experiment carried out by BCG. They compared individuals that used GPT-4 to carry out a task with a control group. And yeah, so individuals that use GPT-4 to carry out the task with a controlled group across different types of tasks. And what they observed is that for creative product innovation, GPT-4 actually improved the performance of these individuals by as much as 40%, right? But for other tasks, such as business problem solving, it's actually resulted in a 23% reduction in productivity, right? So, in some cases, you might not actually need generative AI. From a technical execution perspective, one common theme is that going from a lot of organizations already have some form of proof of concept developed, right? Most people have some chatbots. They've developed some form of, retrieval augmented generation chatbot internally. And we can see this just going on the news, right? But actually taking those proof of concepts into production requires a lot of very different controls, but especially bias controls, knowledge, and predictability. So when I say bias controls, I mean, especially alluding to what Shadow had actually discussed in his previous talk, right? When the outputs of these language models now are representative of their data inputs and the architectures they've been trained on. And what a lot of research is showing is that sometimes the biases in this data can show forth in the output, right? So for instance, as an organization, as an enterprise, I do not want to deploy a tool into production if I know that it could be biased towards a specific targeted group. If my organization does insurance, I want to make sure that if it is providing any insights to an individual, to a customer, it is not saying things that would negatively target their race or gender, right? And we also want to ensure that the outputs of these models, if we're going to put them into production, they're sure of where the knowledge is coming from, right? So we need to be able to define and plan where the knowledge is coming from. And one thing that we observe with language models inherently is that language models don't do planning inherently, right? And they don't necessarily have a knowledge base. So to actually put them into production, we would need to find a way to integrate knowledge that's specific to our domain into that model, as well as predictability. And this relates very strongly to the bias controls as well. So we need to ensure that when a model is actually generating an output for our customer in production, we are relatively sure of the kind of outputs it can generate, right? Because these models generally they have the probability to produce false and harmful statements. A couple of techniques that were discussed that could help with this, retrieval augmented generation, and a lot of bias mitigation techniques. And a lot of that development is actually being done at Vector, and I had the privilege to work on some of that. So in addition to this thought leadership project, I took part in the Fairness in Language Models Lab, as well as the collaborative research project, where we're actually trying to identify if we can build. So one thing is language models can inherently have biases, right? But what if we can actually build a language model that can be deployed as part of a pipeline for an enterprise to do specific content moderation or bias identification and mitigation? And there's a lot of development that's happening in that. Especially, we've developed a tool that can do this, and which is what the metrics schedule was discussing about. But then there's a lot of trends that actually dictate that this is where development is heading towards. So the model that we fine-tuned for our debiaser was the Llama 2 open source model. It's one of the best performing open source models. And about a week ago, Meta actually released a new version of Llama called, it's essentially a safeguard version, which should act as a content moderation tool outside of the regular sort of language model generation pipeline. In addition, from a control and governance perspective, one of the central themes that I observed was developers and users alike need good AI governance training. So in contrast to, sort of what you can call traditional AI, which is, most developments that happened prior to 2019, or even up till today, there's still a lot of development happening there, is that with a lot of these Gen AI tools, right, the inputs from a downstream user can actually have an impact on the model itself, right? So, and the outputs that the model generates in other situations. So one very important thing that needs to happen is that like all other AI development pipelines, the developers need a solid grasp of the rules and regulations to minimize risk associated with AI use. But with Gen AI, the users also need to understand where their data goes and the risks associated with having a closed source model within their pipeline. So a good example here is something you can see on the right. Recently, OpenAI launched custom GPTs. And a big vulnerability with them that people started to observe after is that you can actually ask the GPTs to give you the prompt that was used to create it, as well as even the data that was used to create it, right? A downstream user within an organization that already has allowed their users to use these generative AI tools needs to have a good understanding of where their prompts might be going to be able to mitigate the associated risks. Across the streams, some of the sort of common patterns that were repeated is that Gen AI is advancing rapidly, right? We have existing frameworks that have been developed for traditional AI, for traditional data pipelines, right? We need to be able to ensure that when we are trying to deploy a Gen AI tool, we should meet all of those existing standards, as well as adapt those for Gen AI usage and ensure that those new adapted standards are also being met to effectively mitigate risks. Another thing is that continued industry academia collaboration would significantly benefit both parties. It's not, I mean, as a research institute, we know that like industry lags behind academia in AI developments, right? That's just the truth, right? It's very difficult for an organization that's also focusing on profits, so as well focus on that innovation part. But with organizations like Vector, we have the opportunity for sustained industry academia collaboration, and that will benefit these enterprises in terms of innovation, but also benefit research in terms of funding. And then another salient theme is collaboration across competing organizations can actually enable faster development across the Canadian AI ecosystem. So with regards to that, one, building consensus across the industry, even though organizations are competing, can actually help us decide on what to build and then to start to build it faster. With building, the truth is you might fail. It's better to have a consensus, try, fail, and then try again, in my opinion. And some organizations have advanced farther than others, right? If our goal is to enable development across the entire Canadian ecosystem, we need to ensure that even these competing organizations have the opportunity to develop together. Like a rising tide lifts all boats. In conclusion, I think one of the central themes that we observe through this Gen AI Thought Leadership project is that collaboration is the watchword of innovation. And then through collaboration, we can actually move steps further in achieving our goal of adoption across Canada. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, amazing job, Nifemi, as always. Congratulations. So just like before, judges or anyone in the audience, please ask Nifemi any questions you might have.
So, yeah, Nifemi, thank you so much. Your contribution has been phenomenal to different projects. And as you've been actively involved in the thought leadership projects, would you like to share any success story of any sponsor company adopting generative AI?
I don't think I can explicitly say like a sponsor company, but I do know that across a lot of organizations, there's increasing confidence in actually deploying these tools, right? So companies are actually getting closer to being able to put things in production, and that's a good place to be, I think.
Agreed. Thank you.